a supportive and stable social environment. Interventions include public housing, so we want to decrease social fragmentation. The study in England found that neighborhoods that invest in public social housing, the mobility in and out of neighborhoods declined. Hiring, developing, and supporting well-trained teachers would help decrease teacher turnover, and helping those already in socially fragmented, so developing interventions in schools and neighborhoods that are socially fragmented. So limitations include self-report of physical activity. This is feasible in large studies, however, it's not impossible. In 2011, I published a paper that used, it's the NICHD paper, cohort that used accelerometer collected data for measurement of physical activity. Selection bias, there's a high attrition at follow-up. In the longitudinal study, so the effects may be underestimated. It's a cross-sectional study. The BYS study was a cross-sectional study, so you can't infer temporal sequencing. 1 year follow-up in the longitudinal study. Ideally, I would like to have repeated measures so I could track the trajectories across time of physical activity or physical inactivity. And generalizability. Can I generalize these results to urban settings similar to Boston or to populations similar to Quebec? So future directions. When you look at obesity, for example, you can't just look at physical activity, you have to also look at eating. We know that the physical environment is associated with your dietary intake. For example, again, in 2012, I published a paper where I looked at the close proximity of a grocery store was associated with decreased likelihood of soft drink consumption amongst toddlers. I'd like to identify the relationship between social fragmentation and consumption of high caloric foods. Not just social fragmentation, but all other social factors too as well. And this complements the Momentum Center here at University of Michigan. I also would like to look at the whether or not mental health or stress can act as a potential mediator between the environment, the social environment, and your behavioral health outcomes. So, for example, what are the social contextual factors? So we know that social contextual factors and mental health are related. As I said before, that in England they've showed on numerous empirical studies that the social environment is associated with mental health. So for example, social fragmentation and depression and stress. We know that mental health is associated with dietary intake. For example, Wardle in England, she does a lot of work with toddlers, looking at emotional overeaters and undereaters, so how toddlers react to stress. There's a differentiation, like some toddlers tend to approach food, and others tend to avoid food. So what are the predictors, or why do we develop differing approaches or avoidances to food? Are there cultural differences? Are there environmental differences? So, that would be a very interesting avenue to take. And this also coincides with work by Dr. Looming and also Dr. Peterson's work too as well. So here's an example of a pathway, like social fragmentation leading to stress, and that could change your physical activity and diet. I like to look at physical activity and dietary intake. These are health behaviors. If you refer back to the social determinants of health model, they see these behaviors as mediators in between individual and social determinants, social contextual determinants, and other health outcomes such as obesity, cardiovascular disease. So I'm interested in looking at social fragmentation in sleep and social fragmentation in obesity. terms of methodological advances, not every student goes to school in their neighborhood. Some students go to schools in other neighborhoods. So this is an example of a cross-classified structure where you have students attending schools. So number 5, for example, living in one neighborhood, living in 2, but going to school in number 1. So this type of structure could help combine the 2 studies that I looked at, that I just presented, looking at both the neighborhoods and the school level, like which is more important, the neighborhood or the school, in terms of shaping physical, behaviors of children. So I would also be interested in conducting natural experiments, like taking advantage of natural experiments, of interventions and evaluating them, using more cohort and longitudinal studies, looking at trajectories of change, using alternative measures of physical activity, which I've already have experience with. I've used accelerometer data and pedometer data in the past, and other ways to investigate mediation and mechanisms. So, like I said, I just started looking at mediation. Baird and Kenny was a pretty classic way to start, but there are other new, really interesting ways to look at mediation, such as direct and indirect effects, marginal structure models, structural equation modeling, and latent growth curve modeling. So in terms of professional, I assume if I were to be successful in obtaining a position, I'd apply for new investigator awards, whether it be external or internal, establish a research center that investigates the role of social determinants of physical activity, dietary intake, and also other health outcomes, and also collaborate with an interdisciplinary team. I mean, throughout my, since I started as a grad student, I've been very fortunate to work with people from different disciplines. So even though I started off in biochemistry, I ended up going into nutrition, and then, trying to figure out what I was trying to do, and then I ended up doing physical activity. But I ended up working with other departments and other disciplines. For example, physical education and recreation at the University of Alberta. I went to England to work with the health geography department, where they trained me how to work with census data and how to work with geographical data. And I've also worked with psychologists, right, and other public health professionals. So in terms of training the next generation of researchers, I think it's important to have an interdisciplinary lab and research center. So not just mentorship, not just from myself, but from people from other departments, some other research from the kinesiology department, from other departments in public health, and also to take classes. Again, through my academic career, I've taken courses in numerous fields, and I think it's also important to encourage that too as well to students, so they get different perspectives. And here's an example of an interdisciplinary team that I've worked with, together or separately. Ichiro Kawachi, who's my mentor, is a trained medical doctor, but he's also an economist and a social epidemiologist. Beth Molnar is she's an expert. She does a lot of research in coping strategies when it comes to aggression and violence. Angie Craddock is a physical activity specialist. Sherry Bissett is a psychologist, and Michelle Janos is an education counselor. And I'd like to thank the Canadian Institutes of Health Research for funding my fellowship at Harvard, and I'd like to thank the BYS and the NAN students, the participants, and thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Well, we have time for 10-15 minutes of questions. We'll just open it up and.
Yes.
Two quick clarifying things. I think in both studies you, truncated your variance and your outcome variable. You took a variable that kind of range of 1 to 7 or whatever, made it 0 to 1. Is that because was the distribution of the variable, or did you have a reason for wanting to have less variance in your outcome?
Well, a couple reasons. I think that's a very good question. I could have done a more polycotomous logistic regression with having categorical outcome. But I think with the question, there are limitations in the questions. The question that was given, that was used to assess physical activity. So we wanted something, or I wanted something that had a stark contrast between those who didn't participate in any physical activity and those who participated in some. So if you say that someone is zero, participated in any physical activity, it's a clear contrast to me. So that was one of the reasons. Yes, I think it's a good idea to do some sort of sensitivity analysis, where I could do a different threshold. Say, let's say if you use the Quebec study, use 1 or 2 hours. Use that as a threshold and see if that gets some findings. But I think for that threshold, 0 to 1 or more makes more sense.
Yeah, I only think of it because sometimes when you're getting small correlations, it's because you squeezed all your variance on your outcome. You don't have as much outcome variance to account for when you do that. I don't know. Sometimes variables like that are distributed in such a skewed way that would be the same thing.
Right.
It was just a thought. The other question I had is from the Boston study. You said there were 38 neighborhoods, and you were using the data set on those neighborhoods.
Right.
So what constituted a neighborhood in Boston? What were the 38 units?
The 38 neighborhoods were defined by Boston itself. So we used the neighborhoods that they were given, that were reported for the BYS. So it just made sense to use the neighborhood that they had. There are smaller units of neighborhoods, like suppose, let's say, I'm not really familiar that well with Dorchester, for example. Dorchester is a huge neighborhood. It could be broken down into small neighborhoods. And you could use the option of using 38 neighborhoods or 90 neighborhoods. I chose with 38 neighborhoods because the sample size wasn't large enough. Ideally, if the sample sizes were larger, with more power to use the 90 plus neighborhoods. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm just curious about the neighborhood. I try to do similar research, and you know how a neighborhood defines itself, and just how heterogeneous or homogeneous a neighborhood is could affect the results of a study like this.
Right.
And so, are these 38 neighborhoods fairly homogeneous in terms of like the amount of fragmentation or economic stress, or are they that separate economically and culturally to make a difference, you think?
Well, that's a really good question, and yes, I think it could. I think a next step could be to look at that, to look and see if if you use different sizes, or to account for other characteristics too as well. If I could, that would be a good way to determine if that could have an effect.
My question also relates to this question. So because for example, you did presented two types of studies. One kind of like a neighborhood, another one is the school level.
Right.
So as we just like based on our common sense, different neighborhood, they have different kind of a social characteristics.
Right.
So when you studies, you really want to identify whether a perception of safety as mediated really influence the way they are doing physical activity or physical inactivity. So your two studies, the results is kind of like the social perception of safety as mediated. You hypothesize it's kind of not relate to the outcome. So because the neighborhood, as we know, the school also different. The different kind of even though within the same within the same school district, because some school district is really big, other school district is very small. Maybe within the same school district, the schools could be heterogeneous, not homogeneous in terms of social economic status. Do you feel, and also you use self-report,
Right.
7 days recall.
Right.
Do you feel your results you know, the kind of like the social factors and also like the self-report, like inventory you use, maybe influence the result because based on our just like common sense, we know perception of safety definitely influence the way I choose to do like physical activity, how many times or what type of like activity I do definitely influence. Oh, but your two kinds of like study shows no relationship. So what's the like main reason like based on your like research around like literature review or something and maybe what's kind of like main
Right.
reason?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know why. I hypothesize that safety, at least on adult, our perception